Of course, you never get a photograph until you finally press a button and you're creating what we call an exposure. Exposure. You have several options. Sometimes these options on your new digital camera can be a little overwhelming. Let me see if I can help take away some of the confusion about your exposure options. The first option is the easiest one. It's called automatic. We might say this is a no-brainer, or the point and shoot option. You know, very often, this is the best option. Many photographs are pretty simple for your camera. Your camera doesn't have to think very much, and neither do you. The main issue is to point the camera in the right direction and compose your shot properly. But what in case you need to take a little bit more control of your camera? Another good option would be the program mode. The program mode is very much like the automatic mode, except you have some automatic options or overrides that you can take advantage of. You can maybe increase the exposure or lessen the exposure. Maybe you can adjust the aperture or the shutter speed just a little bit. You also have, on many cameras, a shutter priority option. The shutter is the part of the camera that controls the length of the time that the light from your image is exposed. It's great for sports when you want to freeze action. Or, let's say you want to take a shot in the middle of the night of a street or even stars in the sky. You're going to have to leave your shutter open for much longer than any of your automatic options will let you. Another option is the aperture priority option. The aperture is also called the iris. It's the round window that controls the amount of light that is let through your lens so that you can see the final image. This is a particularly useful mode for formal poses, for macros, which is a shot of something very, very close, or for landscapes. In a certain sense, each of these is automatic. What that means is you have a meter inside of your camera that is measuring the light around you and adjusting the camera. It's just that it's only sometimes adjusting part of the camera, allowing you to adjust the other parts of the camera. As I said, there are many situations where automatic is just fine. For this particular shot, I think that's the mode my camera was in. All I had to do was raise the camera and wait for the hand to be offered. There are ways that we can make sure we get a good exposure. Obviously, having a digital camera is a big advantage, because if we need to, we can get a pretty good idea of what the photo that we just took looks like if we simply play it back or check on it. But there's another way that you can make sure that you get the proper exposure. It's called bracketing. Bracketing is when you take several photos of the same subject using several different exposures. And hopefully, one of those exposure settings hits the target. Some cameras have a bracketing feature called continuous shot mode. You hold down the release and you get 3 shots in 3 different exposure settings. Usually that's on some of the more advanced, more expensive cameras. You can learn to do it manually. But automatic, of course, has its shortcomings. In this particular situation, for example, the overwhelming whiteness of the background fools the camera's brain. It's trying to create an exposure under the assumption that everything should average out to be gray. That's what camera meters tend to do. But that's not this situation, is it? The snow behind our main character should be a lot brighter than gray. But your camera doesn't necessarily know what snow is, so you have to help it. In this case, aim your exposure center usually in the center of your viewfinder at the chest of this guy with the shovel. You might even need to zoom in. Then press whatever button your camera requires for that momentary exposure. Very often you can do this by pressing the shutter release just halfway. Then compose the shot as you need it and press the button all the way through. You'll end up with a photograph that looks much, much more natural. At any rate, when you're taking a photograph, it helps for you to know what you want. Don't just take what you can get. Can you imagine how this particular shot that I took would look if I simply used a flash to fill in all the dark shadows? Look for the quality of light. Is it direct? Is it hard? Is it making shadows? Is that what you want? Or is it diffused, soft, blended, and easier on the eyes in many cases? What direction is the light coming from? Is it offering the kind of detail and contrast that you want? If you do have a flash, you need to ask, Is this the time to use it or not? Is there another way for me to reflect the light that's in this particular situation? Or should I just leave well enough alone and photograph it as I see it? Night photography is almost always very deliberate, and it's perfectly fine to expect to see shadows at night, as we see on the back of this person watching ice skaters. I have particularly favorite conditions that I like for photographing people. However, much of my experience indoors doesn't always offer the light that I want. If I'm outdoors during dawn or dusk, well, that's some of my most favorite lighting. It's soft, and it has a slightly orange, warm feel to it. I also like cloudy or diffuse lighting because I see fewer harsh shadows on faces. And I also have a least favorite type of lighting. I don't really like flash photography. I understand why it's very often used. Journalists are very often in situations where they have to think fast and they have to get some kind of image. So it's very common for them to have a flash. The flash makes sure that at least some kind of image in a courtroom or a sporting event can cause an image to appear. However, flash is going to leave me with harsh shadows, flat contours, red eyes. It's just not a really natural type of lighting. There are other options, though. If you do have a flash, don't toss it out. You can do what's called bouncing the flash. If there's any surface, a ceiling or a wall that I can bounce light off of, it's going to diffuse that light and make it look much more pleasant. Always be aware that if your light is behind your subject, you might end up with nothing but a silhouette, as in this situation. There's a lot of light on the beach, and unfortunately, compared to the light on the front of this individual's face, it's much, much greater. Now, there are situations where you might deliberately want a silhouette. I don't think that was the case here. You need to balance the light in front of your subject and the light behind your subject. In this particular case, I filled in the darkness with a flash. We call this when force becomes necessary. There are times when a flash can be used in daylight to fill in harsh shadows. We call this forcing the flash, or using the flash as a fill. Because the flash unit isn't responding to darkness, you are forcing it. You're telling it what you want it to do. Most cameras have this option these days. In this particular situation, I was out in the harsh sun taking a photograph. And I needed to help the sun in this case when I put the camera on automatic. Well, you can see that there's some sunshine on our subject's shoulders and on the top of her hair. It's behind her, but she looks rather featureless and dark. What can we do about this? Well, one option is to shoot automatic, but to turn on the forced flash feature on my camera. It's pretty good. However, I think I see her squinting her eyes a little bit because she's anticipating the flash. Here's another option, and the one that I tend to prefer. It's called overriding the automatic feature on your exposure and simply increasing your exposure altogether. You'll notice that the sky behind her is much brighter than natural, but her flesh tones are normal. There's a little bit of light on her shoulder, but it does nothing to ruin what we're trying to look at, and that's her face. You know, color doesn't always just happen. You have to look for it. Look for complementary colors. By far, the most important color you want to get is flesh tone, because we all know what skin color looks like. We don't want it to be green or overly red or even bluish. Now, of course, that can be nudged a little bit later than in Photoshop or some other type of photo editing program, but I want you to get out of the habit of relying on that. By the way, in this particular picture, do you think I used natural lighting or do you think I used flash? See if you can tell the difference. When I'm looking for color, I try to look for complementary colors. In this case, green and red are on the opposite sides of the color spectrum. It's a beautiful contrast here. And again, can you guess what my lighting source was in this particular picture? A rainbow of colors is also a fun thing to look for. How many colors can you identify in this vegetable stand photo? By the way, I really like the mysterious character on the left. I wonder what he looks like.